Good. I think we'll have to have it a go, although there's still a lot of people in transit, so to say, outside the hall, but we have an extremely tight schedule. I'm standing in for the CEO of the council, Ben Leica, who for personal reasons couldn't make it here. And on behalf of the African Agri Council, I would like to welcome all of you, members of the private investment community, and especially representatives of government, DFI, ambassadors, etc. Welcome. My name is Frank Bracken, and I'm standing here as non-executive director of Agri, the Alliance of Green Revolution in Africa. And in that capacity, very involved in the agricultural scene in Africa, and some of you might know it. So I'm supposed to keep this day rolling as the day chairman, as it's called, so wish me luck. It's not going to be easy. It's wonderful to see the high response of this conference, and I think it has taken the organizers even somewhat by surprise, over 600 people. And of course, there's a sort of a post-COVID rebound in this, that I'm sure that many of you are extremely glad to feel and touch each other again and have conversation, and you can just sense the excitement in the air. But I suspect there's also something else at play. There's a lot of things happening in the world. There's a lot of nervousness. There's a sense of urgency. There's a sense that something really has to move or something has to give. If you look at what is happening around us in agriculture, there is now a real risk of food security not being any longer an academic topic, but a real hard day-to-day topic. And the specter of starvation is potentially blooming at the horizon. So under this banner of achieving food security through increasing private investment, we have a real big agenda in the coming 2 weeks. It is an ambition that we don't just sit here and spend some good time together, but hopefully that we have a debate, we have a potential here of moving the debate forward. Maybe we can come away from here with a higher sense of urgency and maybe even with new insights. You will have noticed that we have here a great venue. There will be an opportunity for a lot of interaction with practitioners in the field outside. Don't hesitate to visit the stands. I think that is fantastic. And that is also, of course, thanks to our sponsors that you will see labeled everywhere. You'll also see that we have tried to modernize a little bit the setup to have for a more engaging rather than the traditional big, clumsy, white chairs. We try to really instill a new dynamic in the conversation. A couple of practicalities, so to say. If we can put our phones to silent, which includes myself, which I hadn't done. As I already earlier pointed out, we have a really charged agenda. In some ways, the first part is a little bit like the TED Talk formula, like 10 minutes. So it's very challenging for the speakers. I do apologize. That means that there is not as much opportunity for the audience to raise questions because we wouldn't be able to keep to the agenda. But if there's really a question that is burning, try to feed it directly to me, and I can somewhere in the day's conversation or in this afternoon panel discussions, I can feed it into the discussion. Lunch is at 12:30, just outside the conference venue. We might slip over it a little bit, but I promise you I'll protect as much as possible your lunch. And then after the conference, there is a cocktail, networking cocktail just outside the venue. I'm not sure that was on the program. And with that, I think I haven't forgotten anything as far as I can see. Yes, one last thing. Even I want to do it already now, but I just want to recognize the team with Wendy and team. I think they have done an incredible job with limited time and limited resources. So I really wanted to recognize that. Yes. So our first presenter for the day is Dr. Ivan Meyer. He's a senior member of the Provincial Cabinet and Minister of Agriculture in the Western Cape. He's a friend of this council. It's not the first time that he has been here. He's an expert in public governance, finance, and development management. Agriculture is obviously, and in economic terms, a very important player in the Western Cape economy, but also for Minister Meyer, in a personal capacity, is very passionate about the topic. So we are very pleased to welcome him here, and I give the word to Minister Meyer. Thank you.
Firstly, good morning, everybody, and thank you to Frank and to Wendy and all the delegates in the organizing committee. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here. And everybody that has traveled outside the Western Cape and outside Cape Town, but also outside South Africa, a warm welcome to all of you. Frank did mention that there is urgency. That's why, as a minister, I will not arrive late at an important event like this. That's why I was on time, and I was on time the previous occasion. I will not be letting people wait, especially who traveled far to be here, and I'm just local around the corner. So thank you very much, Frank, for pressing on us the importance of urgency. I want to talk briefly, firstly, to introduce my head of the department, because if you in agriculture, you need capable, competent, confident people. Dr. Sebo Petse, please rise. He is my head of the department in agriculture, outstanding, world class. He deserves a round of applause. Thank you. Dr. Ilse Trautmann, my Deputy Director General, responsible for many things, regulation, veterinary services, outstanding, world class. My head of my office, Marieke van Jaarsveld, managing my ministry, world class. Daniel Johnson, my media officer, world class. I mention world class because this conference is about let's put Africa first. You can only put Africa first if you are world class. If you're not world class, Africa will remain in the back. So world class people around you is important to make an impact. And so I want to thank them for the work that they do in the ministry. Can I just get some guidance here? Right. The gentleman that you see there, he was at FASIM on the slide. I visited him. FASIM, as you know, is the biggest trade fair in Mozambique. Are there anybody from Mozambique here? Fantastic. I was at Maputo, world class, fantastic. I went to the Maputo port, world class. That's what I wanted to see. I went to the citrus terminal at the Maputo harbor, world class. And so I am particularly happy for what I have seen in that particular space in terms of Maputo. In fact, the slide that you see on the right top, that's me, also at the fresh market in Maputo. The middle slide that you see there is me at the Maputo port, at the terminal, the citrus terminal, our citrus fruit from Limpopo being exported through Maputo. Our wine on the bottom there, all major wines, particularly on the right-hand side, you see the wine also from Meer list, and they list for Meer in that place. So thank you for Maputo. You've got good taste, and I've seen it in that place. So for us, we want to talk about the GDP per region, the macroeconomic overview of Africa, the policies of industrialization, the agricultural trade perspectives, what are we importing, what are we exporting in the world. Which one do I, okay, there's a time lag. Okay, I think some of the aspirations of the African Union in terms of the Commission set an agenda for the year 2063 for a prosperous, inclusive growth and sustainable development, but also integrated and politically unite the African continent, but also to ensure good governance, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Those things are fundamental if you want to put Africa first. And so to build also a continent that it is united and become an influential global player and partner. Well, with the war in Europe and with the potential nuclear disaster, suddenly Africa is one of the safest places in the world and one of the markets that must respond to the situation. And also agricultural sector is central to Africa's development. In this book, Africa First by Jackie Salier, there is a chapter titled, Mr. Frank wanted a revolution in agriculture. And I am so impressed that this book acknowledges the role and the significance of agriculture and this conference. This conference is a confirmation of this revolution, one chapter in this book. And so Africa is the second largest population in the world after Asia. More than 50% of the African population still resides in the rural areas, and primary agriculture still accounts for a significant part of the GDP in the countries. So what's the share of the GDP at the regional level? We see that 17% of Africa's GDP, that was against the figures of last year, comparable to that of Asia in 1972. And there you can clearly see there is a disparity. 17% of Africa's agriculture in 2021, that was comparable to Asia in 1972, 40, 50 years later. This disparity between Africa and other regions, as you can see on the graph on the bottom, you see Africa's percentage of the GDP, where is Asia, and that has to do with the topics that is on the agenda of this program, Frank, and that speaks to industrialization. It speaks to beneficiation, which is the subject also of this book. So although Africa's agriculture constitutes a large share of the GDP, this has not improved the average standards of living in terms of food security, because it is still a major concern on the African continent. Africa has also the lowest GDP per capita in the world, and to overcome this, the economy will have to grow faster than the population rate. And you see that on the graph there, right on the bottom. So what are the factors limiting the performance of agriculture on the African continent? The normal one that everybody speaks about is infrastructure. Before I had this portfolio, I was the Minister of Finance in this province. The first thing I realized was that we are responsible for about, at that time, 45% of South Africa's agricultural exports. Now, if one province is responsible for 45%, today it is 55%. Now, if you're responsible for 55% of your agricultural exports, primary agriculture, when I was the Minister of Finance, I said that's where our infrastructure must go. Support the agriculture, because that is where the growth and the export goes. So we have seen here the biggest soft fruit industry south of the equator is in this province in the Cape Winelands. And anybody that wants to travel in the Cape Winelands, that's where you get the best road infrastructure. So that's one of the biggest factors that limiting growth. We need to invest in infrastructure. And so access and use of agricultural inputs, infrastructure and logistics. I'm so happy that we have now partnered also with a company in the Netherlands in terms of assisting us with logistical challenges, also the lack of asymmetric access to information, ability to access and adopt new technology, although that is fast changing here on the African continent. I see on the program also the technological partnerships, the investment expansion, skills development and training, and I want to thank also Wesker, who's in the room, for the work that they're doing in terms of investment promotion, also scaling climate-smart agriculture. And that's why Dr. Ilse is here. But I also, Mr. Frank, checked your program. Tomorrow there is a discussion on climate change and innovation. So I'm very happy for those people who will be talking about that particular topic there as well. Well, let us look at the macroeconomic overview of Africa. The size of the world economy is about 3.1%. GDP per capita is about almost 2,000 US dollar. The annual average GDP growth is about 2.03%. Urbanization as a percentage total population is 44%. So although many people are living in rural areas on the African continent, you can see the rate of urbanization, and the share of the total world import is merely 2.8%. Well, if you look at government expenditure, it's one of the key agricultural policy instruments. Now we know that many people in Europe and Africa has to compete, particularly with the Western Europe and other Asian countries, but particularly the West. What do you see in France and in Germany, in those places? You see that those governments give them subsidy for farmers. African farmers, there's no subsidy for farmers. Very little support to farmers on the African continent, and yet we have to compete internationally on a competitive basis. So it is important to take note of the Maputo Declaration that since the African heads of states agreed to commit 10% of their budget to agriculture under the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. And I'm so happy that my department, under the leadership of Dr. Sebo Petse and Dr. Ilse Trautmann, we have now in this province also launched our Africa agriculture strategy for the Western Cape. We are serious about the continent. We are seeing what is happening in the world. 4 days after the war broke out, Mr. Frank, when the war broke out, 4 days later, I met with all the agricultural role players and said, there's war in Europe. And we know the First World War and the Second World War started in Europe. This is serious stuff. And so I brought all of them together and said, let us discuss our strategy because we're a significant export region, but not for the Western Cape, not for South Africa, for the African continent. And so we came together and made plans. And we say we need to capitalize on the benefits of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And that's why I'm so glad my HOD, 2 weeks ago, he returned from Namibia. About 2 months ago, I returned from Maputo. And this for us is more and more significant. My colleagues in my department will soon visit West Africa. So the African continent, I don't know what is the English, but a colleague gave me this book and she wrote inside the book, Afrika lê braak. What is that in English? Huh? Is? Bare. Afrika is bare. Die plek is braak. Daar's geleenthede. Bare means waiting for us. We are here, and I'm so happy for that. So what this seeks is to seek integration, to boost intra-Africa trade, but also to promote the regional value chains. Very important. And the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement is to bring over 30 million people out of poverty, but also to eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers and accelerate deep reforms that will also enhance the growth. Well, I think Africa's industrialization. I've spoken to you about the agricultural revolution in Africa. In this book, Jacques Silier makes the point, and he also concludes in the final chapter of this book about the importance of Africa's industrialization. And so the Africa Industrialization Week aims to reinforce the development of regional industrial value chains, but also provide high political support. That's why I'm here at this conference. That's why I arrived early. That's why I am on time. That's why I appointed the right people that's fit for purpose, that's competent, that's capable. Because I believe Africa's time has arrived, but you cannot arrive. If you arrive late, then Africa will be late. And there's a crisis in the world. There's a crisis politically, there's a crisis in the war, and Africa cannot and must not and should not miss this opportunity. And that's why we are looking for global political realignment. I'm not going to speak to all of the major shifts that you will see in terms of Africa's agricultural imports, but you can see that Africa relies on other regions of the world for imports, for example, cereals, 27%, animal and vegetable fats, 10%, sugar, meat, and dairy, about 6% each. And the Russian war in Ukraine, and I don't call it an invasion. It's not an invasion when babies and mothers and children are killed and people, buildings being bombed to the ground. It is not an invasion. This conference must be united in the condemnation of what is happening in Russia. We cannot accept it. There should be a round of applause. If Africa chooses war over peace, it must be visible. If Africa wants to prosper and Africa wants to be first, there's no way Africa can be silent when there are injustices in the world. And so the impact of the war, and we know from the war there are 50 countries in the world that use bread as a staple food. We also know that Egypt, where COP22 is taking place, is 100% dependent on wheat from Ukraine. And so we understand the impact on food security that the war will have, not only in other parts of the world, but in major parts on the African continent. So South Africa also exports products with the expansion potential, particularly beverages, food preparation, sugar. I'm not going to speak to that. I think tonight, after a beer, you can read that, because a beer does stimulate analytical thinking conceptually and methodologically. The beer makes the figures look even better than it is. That's what we need to put Africa first. So have a beer and dissect these figures. The African market accounts for about 41% of South Africa's agricultural exports to the world, and I think that is significant for us. But I think given what Africa has to offer, I want that to be much more significant, even 10, 20% much more. South Africa's agricultural exports in Africa increased at an annual growth rate of about 3% in the last 5 years. In fact, when I was the Minister of Finance, I also looked at the Western Cape trade in the rest of the world and the Western Cape trade on the African continent. And I was so happy when I looked at the 2018 figures. That was now without the beer. When I looked at the 2018 figures, I saw that the fastest growth in terms of our trade from the Western Cape was on the African continent. So that is great progress. And we will continue now on that path, because my HOD said to his department, Africa will now be the focus of our attention. In 2021, the Western Cape also contributed to 27% of the national primary export to the African continent. Why is that important? 27% of South Africa's total exports on the African continent. It is important because South Africa, Western Cape, is only 10% of the size of South Africa and 10% of the population. So that's significant. Double the rate of our population, double the size of the population. So we are trying to increase that even further. So the 3 top Western Cape agricultural export products to Africa, or on the African continent, because we are part of Africa, you can't go to Africa, you're in Africa, are apples, 12%, cigarettes, 8%, and wine, 7%. I'm so happy because I want to see, as the GDP growth in African countries, we see the increase also in some of our exports in the wine industry, particularly in East Africa, for example, in Kenya, but also in Angola and in Nigeria and Ghana. But I want to see more of that. I'm happy to see a lot of wine being exported also to Mozambique. The top 3 Western Cape agricultural import products from our continent are live cattle, 11%, jam, jellies, and tobacco. Western Cape top 10 export products on the continent, and the top imports that you can also drink. Read with the beer tonight. Frank, you will feel better. So what's our Western Cape contribution to the national agricultural exports? I think all you need to know from this slide is one thing and one thing only, is that the African market accounts for 41% of South Africa's agricultural exports to the world, and South Africa's SA agricultural export on the continent of Africa increased at an annual growth rate of 3% in the 5 years. So this is for us very important, but more important for me is that the Western Cape is responsible for 55% of South Africa's agricultural exports. Well, we did a study, and we looked also at the top 20 key African countries for agricultural trade. Now, what this is, we did a study because, Frank, one of the strategies of our government is data and evidence. Evidence and data-led governance, we call it. And so this is the data, this is the evidence. Sometimes I feel different, but I can't let my feelings and my faith interfere in governance. Because when your fear and your faith and your feelings comes into this business, then you're a Sangoma, a traditional healer. Because they operate on faith, and they cooperate on their fears and aspirations. But we looked at the data, and this data suggests from our survey, the Western Cape Attractiveness Index, compared to the survey, on the right-hand side, you see the ranking, countries featuring on all 3 lists. Number 1, Namibia, Botswana. You see Kenya, Mauritius, Tanzania, Rwanda, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire. And this does not mean that others do not matter. It is just the top 10 that we have selected. But everybody, as you see in terms of the ratings, we have done the research in terms of the Western Cape, potential market access, potential trading partners, and that's where we will focus our Africa agricultural strategy from the Western Cape. I want to conclude, Mr. Frank. I think the African continent presents enormous potential and economic growth. But the word potential means 3 things. It means, firstly, hidden talent, capped capability, and unused success. That's what the word potential means. And I think we need to tap into those 3 things. And we must increase primary production, and it requires investment in post-farm gate value addition. Mr. Frank, we have also, in this province, primary agriculture is 4%, secondary agriculture is 7%, so combined GDP in this province is 11%. So the point that we are making here, agro-processing is significant, and we must drive agri-processing also in your country. And I'm so happy that the gentleman on the right is from Botswana. He's also making agro-processing in a tin, fantastic food that he's making there, and I tasted it, it was wonderful. I want to go back to Botswana, but this was at Fasim in Mozambique. So agri-processing, it is great potential. And Mr. Frank, and where is Wendy? Wendy, we also now have a truck. It's called agro-processing on wheels. We travel from town to town, bringing agro-processing to the community so that we, instead of they coming to the urban areas, we are taking agro-processing to the local communities in making cheese, jam, meat products, patties, sausage. So the agri-processing, the value add to teach people right there, create a business opportunity, real empowerment. This is also what is happening. And this agri-processing on wheels, Mr. Frank, is the only agro-processing on wheels on the African continent. And if there are government officials from the other African countries, I want this conference to make a resolution that you invite and generate agri-processing on wheels, create the old bus, turn it into an agri-processing unit, and move from town to town and teach people, because they are already making it at the church bazaars, in the rural villages, and we want to bring food security and food health sciences and food safety into the business of what they are currently already baking and generating, and upscale it and take it to the next level, give them a label, get them market access, open a bank account, and sustain their business. Secondly, adopt also new technologies. I think will also improve productivity. I came now back from Sacramento in California. I am deeply worried about global climatic conditions. And as you know, California is like us here in the Western Cape, a Mediterranean region. There are only 5 Mediterranean regions in the world. California, Western Cape, 2 regions are 40% of the world's total Mediterranean regions. And we have seen the impact of the fires and the droughts in Mediterranean regions, and the floods and the temperatures now in Europe. And so I'm concerned about climate change. We see extreme weather patterns, and so, Mr. Frank, I'm happy that tomorrow this will also receive. I have asked the Secretary Ross in California to start a 5 Mediterranean agricultural climate summit, because the climate in Mediterranean regions are the same, and we have seen the devastating impact it has on the world, and 5 Mediterranean regions are powerful regions in the agricultural landscape in the world. So that is something that I also value and appreciate. Lastly, I think the significant share of our population is the youth, and which can join also our labor force. And at the previous Conference of Africa Youth Summit that was held here, there was a young man of 23 years old from Ivory Coast, and he's a snail farmer, and fantastic work that he's doing and using innovation in snail farming. And I think what we are seeing at FASIM, I saw young people promoting their businesses on the African continent. The lady at the bottom of the slide, she is making that bags, but the big ones where you see normally when people transport trees or they use in the mines, she is the owner, creator of that bags, industrial bags. Whenever you see a big tree in a bag, think of the youth in agriculture, youth in business. But agriculture, although it starts with a passion, I want it to end as a business, sustainable, growing, and people must make money. We must not be shy that young people are making money, and I'm so happy. Lastly, we created a hashtag, Mr. Frank. The hashtag is for the love of agriculture. And so we are particularly happy that the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement will increase the intra-trade and incentivize investments in trade facilitation. I'm not going to speak more about that. But I must thank and congratulate the Maputo Port Authority. I'm sitting there on the bottom slide at the Port Authority. They have a port training academy. When the harbor is not busy, the staff in Maputo get training on the simulation and handling the containers and all of these activities. And I must say, I was absolutely impressed with what I saw. But nothing beats political stability and ethical and morality to do business on the African continent. I thank you, and that photo was taken in Maputo.
Thank you, Minister. Fantastic. It's a good reminder that governments have an important role to play, and sometimes I wonder whether the private sector has become too much of a Rambo, like we are going to save the world from climate change and we are going to save Africa. And where is the accountability for governments? Actually, I was saying to Wendy, I assume the minister will not be on time. So very, very, very timely minister to remind us how important these small things is and the important role that governments can play. And hopefully that will come back in later discussions and panel discussions. Why is it that we don't hold governments more accountable for just delivering on what they promise? Why is that? So, with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. We are now going to dig a little bit more on public-private partnerships and investments that have to come from the private sector. Is Norman here? Norman Sellier? Because I haven't, is Norman? There's Norman. Okay. Norman, I'm going to introduce you. Sorry, apologies that we didn't have a chance to shake hands before the conference. Norman is the CEO of the Agri Group since March last year. Agri Group is a very important enterprise here in Africa because it handles 35% of the grain value chain in Africa, and there's also several ventures past and future in Africa. With that, Norman, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity. When I was asked to say a few words this morning, I was wondering whether I'm the appropriate person for the topic. But given that this is the African Agri Investment Indaba, it is a privilege for me to be here today in my capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of the Agri group of companies. And listening to the opening conversation earlier on, it dawned on me that I'm perhaps asked to talk from the perspective of private capital. This is an investment Indaba hosted. It's wonderful to be here. It's very nice to see colleagues from around the world that we haven't been able to connect with over the last 2 years. And it's certainly very exciting to be in Cape Town and participating in this conference. Not only do I believe that the agricultural industry is one of the most exciting in the world, but I also believe that its time has come and no more exciting than on the African continent. However, I do believe it's important that government organizations and the public entities that were referenced earlier on understands the complexity and the challenges surrounding private capital allocation into this industry. So first and foremost, I believe that if we look at the GDP numbers that were displayed earlier on the chart, it is true. In developing nations, the GDP percentage derived of agribusinesses or agriculture is in the 18 to 25%, sometimes even as high as 60%. And as economies develop, and industrialization takes place and secondary processing, etc., emerges, the share of GDP drops. But that doesn't mean that the industry doesn't remain as important as it was before. All it really means is that the rest of the country develops on the foundation that has been put there by Agri. So I think that if you look at the Western Cape slides that were shown earlier, it is a reflection of a reasonably well-developed agricultural industry and market that has taken hundreds of years. And if you were to apply that exact same criteria or numbers on the African continent, you'll find various different models emerging. And the one message that will be clear is, if we do not invest in agriculture or agribusiness, the downstream development of those economies will be held back. So it is critically important that conferences of this nature and the mobilization of capital into this industry is accelerated as a matter of urgency. I think what's happened in the last 24 months around the world with COVID and the lockdown has highlighted the importance of the industry, not only that it's critically important from a food security point of view, but also that the independence that is required to remain secure is challenging and requires long-term thinking by both public and private enterprises alike. At the Agri group of companies, we are a vertically integrated group that our business operations span grain handling, grain infrastructure management, grain marketing, financing, equipment, services, supply, processing, etc. And it is clear that if you want to succeed in the agri industry, you have to think much broader than individual silos. It's a critically important concept to think about. If you look at agriculture in its individual segments, you'll find an incredibly volatile industry, very cyclical, and private capital is afraid to play in that space. But when you look at the industry as a whole over the long period of time, it is a very attractive industry. So I think the challenge that we have is mobilizing capital into this space, and the topic I was asked to talk a little bit about is what is needed as part of private and public partnerships to boost sustainable investment in food agri, especially in a post-COVID world. And I think in that sentence is a few powerful words. Public-private partnerships. At Agri, we've just repositioned our group and we've introduced as a tagline, Agri, your partner in agribusiness. And I emphasize to everybody in the organization that if you think you're going to be in Agri without recognizing the importance of partnerships, you won't last long. This industry is tough. There will be droughts, there will be floods, the ports will close, the borders will close, there will be diseases, etc. And over time, we need each other, both internally within the competitive private landscape, but also with public participation and public entities. Comments were made earlier on is, what does the government need to do? What do these public entities need to do? And I sometimes want to share this metaphor, if you will. Put yourself in the boardroom of a private company that needs to decide whether or not to allocate capital into an investment case. Capital is competitive, and the world is open, and capital can go anywhere. So now put yourself in that boardroom and ask, would you invest in a 15-year project to grow avocados in a country that has got no port infrastructure, no cold chain storage, where the ships do not dock on a regular basis, and where the country-to-country agreements are not in place, and where you do not know whether you'll be able to get your money out of that country 15 years from today, when eventually you potentially may sell your investment. And if you think about it from that point of view, the public participation and the public-private partnerships are so critically important. Put yourself in the shoes of a board or a person that has to allocate capital into this sector. It's difficult. There are so many things to think about, so many variables to take into consideration, that if the path towards that investment and the realization of that investment isn't smoothed and isn't simplified, capital will remain on the sidelines. So the agri-industry for Africa is probably the most important industry. It's a long-term industry. It requires capital. But for every dollar spent on the primary side, the downstream benefits is greater than any other industry. I believe it's the industry that also offers the greatest opportunity for meaningful impact. Job creation, food security, health, environment, sustainability, upliftment of communities. No other industry can offer the downstream and secondary benefits than investment in the agri-industry. If you look at what's happening around the world now with technology and data, and I put myself in the shoes of a young person that has got to decide what to go and study, I can't think of another industry that offers as many opportunities in data, technology, computers, drones, unmanned equipment, science in the fertilizer industry, nutrition, etc. Everything that is exciting about business in the world at the moment finds itself magnified in the agri-industry. So from an investment thesis point of view, I think it's very exciting. Coupled with that is the opportunity for infrastructure capital and deployment. Now, if you think about the topic, private-public partnerships to boost sustainable investment in agri and food, the infrastructure investment opportunity is immense. The investment that's required in ports, infrastructure, road, storage, and all of the enabling environments required in agribusiness offers, in my opinion, one of the greatest opportunities for capital deployment on the continent that I can think of. Then, coupled with that is the interdependencies between the public and the private partnerships. So if I have to conclude from the perspective of a private entity in the space of agribusiness and what is needed to boost sustainable investment, I would say that the public entities and the public bodies involved with the agri value chain need to understand that they need to open up the door and remove obstacles for the private sector to play. Private capital is short-term in nature, much shorter than government and public funds. And because of that short-term nature, there are a lot of obstacles in the way that needs to be removed. If they are removed, capital will flow because the industry is very, very exciting. I also believe that in order to achieve an ultimate goal, there must be a clear vision. I always talk about South Africa, and I think back of the Soccer World Cup. For about 5 to 8 years, this country was absolutely aligned in a common goal, and that was to deliver the 2010 Soccer World Cup. And for 8 to 10 years, there was no fighting. It was full alignment. Projects happened, and eventually it was delivered, and it was euphoria in the country. If I think of Agri on the African continent, and I think of food security, and I think of all the macro numbers that are published around the world, there can be no denying that we need to solve food security. We've got the right continent with the most opportunities, with the best climatic conditions, and it's shouting out for an opportunity to be grabbed. If we can state that publicly, put it on the wall, have a common vision and a common goal, I think the continent can align around one of the most exciting capital investment opportunities in the world. So I'd like to conclude just by saying the private sector will play with good and strong long-term public-private partnerships. This is an exciting industry to be in, and Agri as a company, and I know I can speak of many of my colleagues in this industry too, would be more than happy to play. We are ready, the private sector is ready, I think private businesses are ready to play, and with the right partnerships, there's no reason why it can't be a massive success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norman. You are ready for TED Talks, clearly. You held very strictly to your time window. Thank you very much. An interesting point, that perspective from the boardroom, when you said, imagine you're sitting in a boardroom and you have to make a capital allocation decision. I've always been surprised how many people think that the real issue is that private sector capital doesn't understand Africa or doesn't know about Africa, rather than understanding that there is real engagement from the public sector in terms of infrastructure required to justify that involvement of the private sector. So thank you very much. Very, very engaging, clarifying talk. The next speaker I would like to introduce under the same topic is Rod. Rod, are you here? Rod Bassett? Oh, there he is. Rod is United Green. He's not South African, he's Australian. But traveled the world. He's currently director and head agriculture and food investment with United Green, originally from Queensland, but as I said, he has traveled the world, and I'm sure he can give us a little bit of a global perspective. Before he joined United Green, he had various roles in multinational conglomerates in the agro and related industry. Thank you very much.
Wow, this lighting's not so good for 50-year-old eyes with the old-fashioned notes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about public-private partnerships, but an even greater pleasure to meet some colleagues and associates that I've never actually met face-to-face before. With the COVID situation for the last few years, we've been working very closely with the likes of IFC, etc., and I met a colleague for the first time. We've been talking for 2 years, so it's great under this environment to be able to meet people face-to-face and talk about this very important topic. Very, very good talk to follow from Nigel, I believe. Sorry? Norman, sorry. So he's allowed me to get straight to the point, actually. I want to keep to my time. So this is more a bit of a case study. Public-private partnerships are a part of the DNA of United Green Group. So who are we? We're a private strategic investment group based in Mayfair in London. We have over 50 businesses globally, over 3,000 people employed. Our main investment strategies are around property and renewable energy. And in the renewable energy, we have a 20-year heritage where the majority of those investments are in the developing and emerging market context, and the majority of them are with public-private partnerships with sovereign wealth funds and or investment institutions, state investment institutions. So public-private partnerships are a real part of the DNA of our organisation. Our most recent investment strategy, that started about 4 years ago, and building on the legacy of some investments in the food industry, is our global food security investment thesis. Our investment strategy is to develop inclusive, scalable, regenerative, climate-smart food systems, predominantly here in Africa. Africa is at the hub of our investment strategy, whilst it is a global investment strategy. We currently have a pipeline of 8 countries, And our objective is to deploy at least $3.5 billion in sustainable agri-food systems here on the continent over the next 5 years, starting in 2023. We had a meeting last week with our investment committee. They're pushing me, how can we deploy $5 billion? And I'll sort of go on to about that as well. But I really want to reinforce systems development. We've put boots on the ground even during COVID over the last 3 years. We see current agricultural investments are very narrowly focused. They look at either value chains or a specific part of the value chain. We see many white elephants, we see many train wrecks. If you build a factory, they don't understand the market, or they haven't got the supply. Or if they've gone into farming, they don't know how to get the inputs into the country, or they haven't got a market. So what we're looking to do is to develop these very inclusive, and by inclusive we mean community as well, so we consider these as public-private community partnerships. How do we go from putting in everything from inputs, agri-services, nucleus estate farming, outgrower schemes, manufacturing, value-added manufacturing, through to consumer-branded goods. Now, what are the contexts that we're operating in? As I said, we've been focusing on this strategy now for 3 years, and we've spent a lot of the time, at least 50% of our time, on the ground, even throughout COVID. And what do we see? We see fractured supply chains with our food systems, particularly because of COVID and obviously with the Ukraine war. We see climate change, the realities of it. I would call it climate chaos. Some of the impacts of the drought in East Africa is very disheartening, and there are not the solutions that are going to drive real positive change there for a number of years. The system is too devoid of some of the structural elements that will allow that to really come back quickly. We see rapid rates of environmental degradation, soil decline, organic matter getting too low, a lot of scorched earth policy around land clearing, etc. It is true that Africa does have about, I'm told, about 2/3 of the available arable land left to develop. But let's not destroy that. Our approach, our development approach, thus far, is actually going to cause massive degradation in that area. And we see, obviously, perverse inequality. So this is the context that we're operating in. We are very energized with the opportunities, building on the last week. There is private capital, is very much committed to solving the problems associated with agri-food systems on the continent. But as a generalization, though, private sector alone is not the answer. We've seen that. As I said, we've studied the train wrecks, we've studied white elephants, etc., and there are limitations of government. We see a massive opportunity within our group, building on the legacy and success of our renewables business. We see agricultural, public-private community partnerships as a core strategy, a core solution to solving the problems with food security or food sovereignty of nations, of African nations. So moving now into a case studies type context, there's 4 areas that we see and have learnt that hopefully others can review and learn, because we're only one organisation. If we do deploy $5 billion over the next 5 years, it's a drop in the ocean to what is required on the continent. So, we are looking for more people behind us. There is plenty of private sector capital available for investment in Africa. We're sitting in London, but the risk factors mentioned by our previous speaker and the timing. The thing with public sector, they need to understand is private sector wants to deploy capital in a timely manner. You are competing for this capital. So we have to become more efficient in our systems. So there's 4 key areas, hopefully I can keep to my 10 minutes. Firstly, we need to create collaborative and supportive environments. We have to acknowledge that private sector and public sector, we think differently. Very much in terms of strategy, our ideology said we are different, but coming together we can create something special. It's important, and we've learnt, and we've made mistakes, to forge alliances. Create partnerships that are aligned with the message, aligned with that strategy, what we want to deploy on the ground. And very important to us as a UK-based organisation, very proud to say that through the UK Department of Investment and Trade, the High Commissioners, They have been integral with providing credibility of us as an organisation, our integrity due diligence, understanding our strategy. They have travelled with us to our pipeline countries. They've put boots on the ground with us. We've forged a real collaborative environment. You've got David Burton here, who's head of the agriculture for DIT. He gets on a plane and he comes to the country, sits in front of ministers with us and said, right, this is what we're trying to achieve. Create that alignment of strategic objectives. Another organisation, Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. They have personnel in government, understanding, refining policy, using that organisation to help convey to them the strategic intent. Something that we've learnt the hard way. As I said, we've been 3 years down this journey and we've only just signed our first deal in Kenya, if everyone's seen in the press last month. We've learnt to work very closely with the ministries in a country on alignment of strategy. We talk to the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Finance. We look at their trade balance. We looked at the import substitution. We do not impose business models on any country. We work with the governments and we say, right, what system is required to move the needle in a catalytic and meaningful manner? It's one project. It's a catalytic greenfield investment, a new system that will move that needle. So we work very closely with government and we've got 8 projects across the continent at the moment in the pipeline. Every single project is different, whether it's dairy in Nigeria to chickens and rice in Angola to rice and cotton in Kenya. It's all based on the strategic need of the country, where they see the strategic imperative. And don't forget our private sector technology partners. We bring them to the table. We look to establish long-term partnerships, whether it's in irrigation, farm machinery, precision agriculture. Partners who can genuinely drive climate-smart, climate adaptation farming techniques for both large-scale and smallholder farmers. They are absolutely essential in building the trust in the system that you're trying to build on the ground. And as I said to governments, we've been patient. It's taken us 3 years and we've just signed our first agreement. But we need public sector to up the ante. We can't be lost in the bureaucracy because we do know that there are other private sector, private investors in London who've been turned off by the delays that we've faced. We are real boots on the ground people and we have faced significant delays. There needs, number 2, there needs to be an overhaul of the policy and strategy frameworks. It is absolutely crazy, some of the public partnership, private partnership laws, public-private partnership acts. They've been written predominantly for infrastructure. They do not cater for agriculture. And there's a great example in one country. There's upfront fees, extortionate upfront fees, just to register a PPP project. And you might go through the process and they may not approve it, but you don't get that feedback. There's a lack of understanding of the development process, a rigorous development process that we undertake with the development of these new systems. And there's also the lack of understanding around intellectual property. We have a proprietary development process. As I said, it's very rigorous. It actually takes about 12 months before we sign an agreement, before we get to financial close. We look at many aspects, so I'll go on a little bit later, but they do not counter for that IP. And in many instances on the PPP approval boards, there's not even the Minister of Agriculture or anyone from the agriculture sector. So this is a major hindrance when you look at some countries and the policies. So we need those improvements around policy. I'm not a big fan of subsidies, not at all, but Africa, as mentioned, has enormous productivity potential. It can, I mean, we all understand that, but there needs to be a rebalance on some of the critical imports that will enhance productivity. And I do see a place in policy that we can look at subsidising critical inputs such as fertilisers, etc. We probably need fertiliser, reduce our fertiliser usage and put in regenerative practices in developing economies. But here we really need to, before we get to really regenerative and climate smart farming systems, we need some of these key inputs to raise productivity. Thirdly, business model and investment design. As I said, the process to do this and not become another train wreck or another white elephant It's a very rigorous process. Everything from pre-feasibility, feasibility, the design, the engineering, and all the HR and operational, we do that up front. It's extensive and it's long, and many people, we look at that, we're surprised at how much capital is being deployed. And I'm going to say what we've reviewed, over 90% of the private sector-led projects we've seen has been based on pro forma business plans. It just astounds us the amount of capital that has been deployed based on that. Now, there are partnerships as well, public partnerships. Again, I go back to the UK government. There's UK Manufacturing Africa has supported us with market studies. The UK Growth Gateway. There are these organisations out there for private sector to leverage because they want to see success. They want to attract private sector capital into the agriculture sector in Africa. So leveraging those partnerships as well. But when we do get into the design phase, and it's extensive, it requires anywhere from 2 to 4% of capital development, that cost. It's a major investment, is then to collaborate with development partners, civil society, particularly around community engagement. So if we look, and I specifically mentioned our Kenya project, we're now talking with the likes of IDH, Technoserve, the Gatsby Foundation. How do we refine our business model engagement with the rural communities? Because we will put in a system, that system relies on the rural communities being active participants. We're here to raise their productivity, we're here to raise their incomes, and create a market for them, as well as providing that knowledge. So that business model design process is critical, but partnerships are also very, very important there as well. And finally, around the financial. This is an investment forum. With our public-private partnerships, we sort of look at that as from a capital contribution perspective. We are very happy. We're confident now. We've spent the time on the ground. We understand the market. Maybe not the best, but better than most. We understand the risks. We understand the upside. It's part of our DNA within the organisation. But when we look at private-public partnerships, we look at skin in the game, capital contribution from our public partners. Our investment structure is we take a majority position, we partner with sovereign wealth funds and or investment institutions with the country to create that transformational catalytic system and a reinforced system, a greenfield system that's of enough scale that will move the needle and have a positive impact in the country. As I said, there's a development process. That takes risk capital. And that, as I said, could be 2 to 4%. That could be anywhere from $5 to $10 million in just upfront feasibility, design, engineering, etc. We also look for that skin in the game from our partners at that stage, because then we know, we have the confidence, this is a strategic imperative and it's a problem that they want to solve. We co-design the business model and we co-fund that. Now, there are other institutions out there who can reduce the risk burden for our partners. We're very proud to be working with the likes of IFC Upstream. It's a great product. I believe DFC has something similar. There are institutions out there who are willing to put in place and commit capital and support the process. One thing that it has astounded us as well is the limitations of government and their understanding around project financing. So obviously with the public and our private and public capital coming together, it's amazing how many discussions I still have with government. Oh, what's the interest rate, et cetera? What's the length of the loan? It's actually still a journey to explain what project debt financing is. The opportunity for governments to have off-balance sheet debt financing. And that's something that's unique through public-private partnerships, is the non-requirement for sovereign loans. And this could be a major, and this is why we see, and we're trying to promote with governments, this is a major opportunity for you. I think we saw in the first presentation, governments are committed to 10% of their budgets to agriculture. They're not contributing anywhere near that at present. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in ministerial budgets, particularly in agriculture. Park a little bit, a fraction of that, $50 to $100 million into a strategic PPP every year, then we'll start moving the needle. There's the opportunity around carbon markets, and probably the last topic around, it's not so much finance, it's around land. It astounds us how much idle public land is sitting out there in countries. It's either underproductive, it's sitting idle, it's bankrupt, it's a parastatal that's bankrupt or in receivership. We need to get that land repurposed for food production. So in summary, as an organisation, we are fully committed to agriculture. We see the potential of Africa. We believe in Agri public-private partnerships moving forward. And yeah, thank you very much.
Well done. Excellent. Rod, I also taking a key message out of what you said. $5 billion is there somewhere waiting to be invested. So there's still many of us who think that availability of capital is the challenge rather than ability to deploy the capital that is the challenge. So I take that. And the other point that I also take from what Rod was saying is that capability, competency, capacity to receive on the side of the investors or the public sector also seems to be a critical bottleneck. Now, on to the next speaker, Simpiwe Samdiala. He is one of the shareholders and chief executive officer of Amedlelo Agri. I take it that Simpiwe is here? Wave your, oh, there he is, Simpiwe. Welcome. So he's basically a shareholder and an operator in a majority black-owned agri-business with operations in dairy and diverse other investments, mainly in South Africa, I believe. He's also a long-serving board member at the Eastern Cape Development Corporation. Simpiwe, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. You know, as I was listening to the last two speakers, I thought, what am I going to say about public-private partnerships? A lot has already been said, and a lot of good things. I think the question that I've been asked to respond to, what is needed as part of public-private sector investments to boost sustainable investment in agriculture, especially in a post-COVID context and current food security. I'll skip quite a few slides because a lot has already been said. And I will share with you some of the lessons we've learned as well. And there's this presentation from an ECDC perspective. We finance a lot of rural agriculture, but also as an investor, we really, almost on a daily basis, see what food security looks like. And just to refresh your memory, when we talk about food security, we talk about affordability, we talk about availability, quality and safety, as well as sustainability and adaptation. So the context of my presentation will be informed by these key areas that really talk to food security. Where are we? Food security is at a tipping point. Some of us will remember in the 60s when we were talking about Green Revolution. At the time, the focus was on how to improve productivity. And over the years, we've seen globally countries being more and more food secure. But what we are seeing now recently is that more people and a larger portion of the global population are hungry today than in 2015. Those are the numbers that we see. And what is driving that? If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, with the lowest, and there's a lot that still needs to be done. And after everything that we've seen happening, and now the recent war and post-COVID. And one of the things that all of us are aware of is how input prices have gone up and how that has impacted quite a lot on food security, especially poor and rural areas. I think more importantly, one of the things that for us is quite interesting is how this whole trend has actually reinforced the importance of private-public partnerships. You're stuck in a rural area, you're sitting there, and you're looking for support. You're looking for private sector companies, you're looking for government to intervene. And at the center of this, what we are seeing globally is that through PPPs, we can be much more secured. But what is driving those public partnerships in the context of food security? Research and development. We're also looking at PPPs being very, very important on productivity and technology improvements. Think about it. Without these partnerships, how do we share knowledge that universities have? How do we ensure that those technologies, the research that's being done, is mainstreamed? Because more often, if there are no partnerships, we have all these advancements in technology, but they're not shared. We don't know about them sitting in those rural areas and those poor and far remote areas. Market access is one of the key drivers of these partnerships, as you have heard. I'm not going to talk about finance because a lot has been said already. You may have land. Most rural Africa has land. But what we generally lacking are these technologies, market access, and these relationships that will take us forward. I think management, skills, and the resources is what is driving these partnerships to ensure food security. Indigenous knowledge is important, but the world has moved. The new innovations, and there's these things that we really believe through these PPPs will drive and really change the picture in the context of rural development. What needs to be done? The first thing we believe needs to be done is to share these experiences. We believe that a lot, and globally, this is happening. In Africa, there are a lot of these partnerships that are taking place, and more often, they're not shared. How a conference like this one, can we use it to really share the experiences, both failures, because you don't want to repeat them, and successes. PPPs are also, you have a lot of failures where, because sometimes the relationships are not equal, communities are left much poorer than they were before that relationship. But how do we then learn from that, avoid such experiences? But more importantly, we know that it is through these partnerships that we have seen advances in food security. Can we share those? Can we use that platform to really share and make sure that even the most remote areas can look at these funding models, these partnership models, proactively engage with partners that have demonstrated interest and they've actually invested in the most rural areas. I think that's one thing that I think, for me, is important in the context of this conference. I think the second one, much as we see these experiences globally, and a lot of research done at even university level, there are sometimes no guidelines, just to make it easy. More often you would hear, the land tenure system is not conducive. But next door, something has happened. One of the things that we would propose governments to lead, and I'm not suggesting that only government, because the private sector has also experienced that, with these different commodities in agriculture, these different experiences in the agri value chains. Can we develop policies or guidelines that make it easier for private partners, communities to invest, to create new opportunities, looking at all the lessons that we have learned? One of the things that as the ECDC believe in, but also as an investor in agriculture, is that it can take lesser time if we knew and we learned from all these experiences to make decisions quicker and to really change the food security trajectory that we believe is at a tipping point. And to change that, we believe strongly that PPPs are the solution, and we all need to play a role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are 10 minutes, 15 minutes behind schedule, so I'll try to keep the pace. The next speaker I would like to announce is Mr. Wenzel Oker. He's currently the chairman of Wallflower Investments Group. Before was the principal fund manager to a South African domicile development investment fund, but he's also an academic. He has done quite some study and research in the area of private equity and venture capital investments in both agribusiness and infrastructure projects. So I'm sure that Wenzel can give us a broader perspective. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. My name is Wenzel, as I've been introduced. I'm based at Stellenbosch University on the academic side, and I'm involved in private equity and venture capital. Before I decided, when I was asked to speak about private equity per se and the impact of private equity on the agricultural sector, and more importantly, fostering Africa's socioeconomic and sociopolitical themes, and we heard from the minister, the first speaker, speaking about a lot of policy and macroeconomic issues. There was one fact that comes out that was quite astounding. If you look at private equity spend around the world, for the last 10 years, year on year, less than 1% gets spent in Africa. And it was quite an astounding fact. So the question is, how do we foster greater allocation of private equity and private capital to Africa? And listening to some of the speakers, we'll be talking about private equity, we're talking about agriculture. We're not just talking about investing in farms and specifically agricultural businesses. I think it's more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. What we have here is, we're talking about infrastructure, we touch on infrastructure, we spoke about ports, important critical utility type infrastructure that backs this. So when you look at what are those choke points that's restricting the flow of capital, private capital, and you look at these facts, and there's 4 broad points that I want to touch on. The first point has been touched on already, and most of the points that I'm going to touch on, has been noted and will be noted throughout the duration of this conference. And the first one we all know, and we're not going to regurgitate all the potential. And potential, represents opportunity. And if you're any investor and you're sitting and you're looking and you're sitting in your investment committee, like Norman said, you're sitting in your board, you look at what are the opportunities. and any investment strategy is backed by what are the opportunities. And we know that based on the potential on Africa, by 2035, we will have a workforce of over 1 trillion. We know that 1 in 3 people born today are African. If you look at other countries like Europe, and you look in China, for example, where there's, population growths have peaked, and this, it's in certain regions, there's, workforce has become a challenge. And also, Africa's endowed with great land and resources. And the last time we checked, God's not making any more land, and it's a non-renewable resource, an important resource. So we take all these opportunities and the potential, and you're sitting as an investor, and you're looking at it, and let's for the purpose of it, let's talk about this typical private equity model, this third-party private equity model that we've adopted from the US, where we have a fund, and there's some people sitting in the room that are busy trying to raise funds. Some have raised funds. We speak from the chaps from the UK. Rob, that says he's got 5 billion that he wants to deploy, and is a challenge in deploying that 5 billion. And I'm sure there's people here that would like to get part of that 5 billion. I think this private equity model is very important. And private equity, when I speak about private equity, I think we have to make an important distinction. It's a respected asset class. Like, when an investor sits there, whether you're one of the big pension funds, whether you're one of the big DFIs or institutions, and you're talking about private equity, and when I talk about private equity, I'm using it interchangeably with venture capital. You're sitting there and you're looking about listed equities, you're looking about real estate, you're talking about fixed interest, and we come back to a lot of that's been discussed. We're talking about themes as well. We're talking about impact investment, we're talking about ESG. Those are themes. On the other side, we have private equity as a respected asset class. And how are we going to use this asset class to foster socioeconomic transformation? How are we going to make sure that we deal with the issues of food security? Because at the end of the day, you investor, you're sitting there and you have to allocate money. You're not going to say, I'm going to allocate money to food security. What does that mean? So one has to be careful when one deals with themes, and themes are very important. But it comes to that issue of my second point about portfolio theory, because portfolio theory is very important, and portfolio theory is based on 2 broad aspects, qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. And we have certain investors that want a return. Some want to preserve capital, they want to invest. We're all going to talk about blended finance and the importance of blended finance and grant funding to kickstart investment in the agricultural sector and in terms of much needed infrastructure. And that's important. Investors want a return on their money, but at the same time, there's that qualitative analysis, the do-good, that they want to be an impact. We want to create jobs. We want to make sure that we have sustainable practices, whether it be on the regenerative agriculture and farming. So themes are important. I mean, when I speak to chaps who want to start and they want to raise funds, and people that want to start raising funds, the first thing they say, we're going to start a fund, we're going to start a venture capital fund, and we're going to target $50 million, and we're going to have a particular focus, and our fees is going to be 2%, and the normal 2% and 20% carried interest model. Sometimes what's missing is that qualitative aspect, because there are a lot of prevailing themes that are currently out. Quakers helped emancipated slaves and called it SRI. So this is not a new concept, and themes are changing, and it's very subjective. So what's important for Africa, and when you listen to a lot of the speakers, what's important, what are those important themes on which you want to base your investment strategy? And so that's an important, I think portfolio theory is very important. I mean, I always remind people around themes. When I looked at one of the biggest investors in South Africa is the Public Investment Commission. And if you look at the PIC Act, when the PIC Act looks after the Government Employees Pension Fund, and when it was promulgated in the 90s, there's a section, I believe it's section 5, I speak under correction, it says 3.5% of what the PIC manage must go towards social responsible investment. It never mentioned an asset class. It mentioned a theme, and what did social responsible investment mean at that given point in time in South Africa's history? And it was promulgated by the late President Mandela. And today it led to what is today what we all know as the Indaba Fund, which is a big fund that invests in alternative investments, in unlisted investments, etc. So themes are very important. So I think when one applies portfolio theory, then there has to be greater engagement between the custodians of these funds, which is basically on the principal agent relation, where you're talking about private equity fund managers or asset managers, and you've got your investors. There has to be greater engagement. When I spoke to Brian earlier, I mean, he mentioned that there's a lot of capital. that wants to deploy it. But what I find is there's a lack of connectivity in terms of talking. These conferences are very important. And Rob mentioned that he gets frustrated and he talks about public-private partnerships. But there has to be something more than that, where there is engagement with people, fund managers on the ground. I mean, I've just come back from a trip from Namibia, and where we technical partners and speaking to an Agri fund in terms of helping in developing their thinking. And one thing that's important, I mean, because that's one of the other aspects, criticisms with regards to private equity on the continent, is the lack of fund managers, what they typically want to call GPs, which is basically a reference to a partnership structure, is the lack of talent and the lack of skill. But there is also that narrative that says that existing fund managers with track record have an important role to play to become as technical partners to emerging fund managers in the region and in the area, because that will also help with the greater deployment of capital. And also the fact that you have these kind of choke points where big institutional investors with lots of money, and it's very difficult to deploy. So what they do is they engage with government, etc. And at the bottom, just a level below that, you find these managers with great ideas that want to start funds, that want to deploy capital, that sees the opportunities on the ground. They just don't have that access and nobody's talking to them. And the typical example would be as well to say that private equity is illiquid, the African capital market is not deep enough, so lack of exit opportunities are real, etc. It comes back to that issue of connectivity, because we adopted this model, and we can't compare ourselves to the US capital market, which is the largest capital market in the world, as dollar denominated, which is the world's currency, etc. And we try to knock a square peg into a round hole. And the one important and the last point that I want to make, just from broad considerations, when looking at private equity and this private equity model that we're trying to use, which is predominantly being used in Africa to deploy capital, is that this typical 10-year self-liquidating fund. So a typical private equity fund, as that most people would know, it's 10 years. There's a 5-year commitment period. After 10 years, the fund gets self-liquidated. One feature that we've identified, that 10-year period is actually too short. The period should actually be longer. Investors should consider looking at 15-year to 20-year periods. Perhaps the private equity self-liquidating model is not the best. There have been a move where people are looking at investing via permanent capital vehicles, which is evergreen, because one of the criticisms of the third-party self-liquidating fund model has been that you have a good investment, so you have 3, 4 investments or 5 investments in a fund, and one of them are doing exceptionally well. Because of pressure from investors and wanting to return capital and to make a return, one gets to a point where you are self-liquidating very good investments and having to sell good investments in that portfolio. So we need longer periods. We need more patient capital. For example, another feature is hurdle rates, where investors are sitting there and they say, we want the hurdle rate to be X. Perhaps there has to be a reconsideration reducing that hurdle rate for Africa, where you have your typical 8 to 10% hurdle rate, which should be 5 to 8% as an example. That's one consideration. The other typical model is your 2 and 20% fee model. Perhaps you should have a different model, because I've seen on the smaller type funds, the fees are higher, where investors turn around at the end of the day, can't find enough transactions, and the investors get upset because they end up paying lots of fees and fund managers can't execute on the deal flow. But perhaps look at how you look at the carried interest, because carried interest is the magic sauce, where you go in and say, look, we charge 1% management fee, but we want a higher carry. And I think we need to develop this concept of a super carry. So if a fund manager meets his benchmark and his hurdle return, we should look at some form of super carry in how you calculate. So instead of 20%, you should be getting 25%. So there's a greater alignment of interest. But in all of this, if I look at this, I think the important themes, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about migration. What we're going to find is, and we talk and we bring all of this together in terms of infrastructure, private equity, agriculture. What we're going to find is one thing that I would like, that I can see it's happening, is that we're going to have much more mega cities on the continent. We're going to find people move because of opportunity. There will be greater migration to mega cities. The battle towards net zero will be lost and fought in cities. And I think, therefore, it's very important how we look at this aspect of private equity. So if there's capital that needs to be deployed, and there's definitely opportunity. It's the question, is that custodian, that middleman, asset managers and private equity fund managers, there has to be greater engagement. And my own advice is don't run off and try and raise a fund based on the concept of 2 and 20 and what's your return going to be. Have greater engagement with investors. So if you listen to the chaps from the UK, They definitely got deployment of capital. And the last point that I think that Africa really needs is 1 or 2 large private equity fund of funds, because I believe they can reduce the downside risk, deal with issues of liquidity, deal with issues of creating a better capital market, greater liquidity through secondary market investments, through co-investments. So when directors at big institutions that have got feet on the ground, like when that Norman Cillier runs, and they're sitting in the boardroom and they have to go through this whole avocado case study type model, there has to be greater participation, and where private equity fund of funds could, for example, play a role. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenzel. You raised some very, very interesting points, and I hope that they will come back in the discussions in the rest of the day and tomorrow. Is the private equity model suited for purpose? Is it the time horizon, or should it be evergreen? Is the 2% and the carry? So some very fundamental questions, so thank you for that. I would like to announce the next presenter, David Burton, who has been mentioned. Hi, David, welcome. He's with the DIT UK. David is a highly experienced development professional, 26 years in the international development scene. So I'm sure that he can give us his own perspective on the topics that we have been touching on. Welcome, David. Sorry? Is the presentation loaded? Wendy? Yeah. So there's the pointer. Just use the green one. Okay, thanks, David.
Well, morning, everybody. How are we? Are we keeping awake? Okay, I'll try and make this a bit more interesting. No, I'm joking. Okay, my name's David Burton. I work for the UK Department of International Trade. I cover all of Africa. I'm a sector director, which is a very interesting job. I've been given a question. Yes? Are we seeing a stronger appetite for M&A and investments in the agricultural sector? It's a question, yes? Which button do I press? Which button do I press? The green one. Yes, we are. Thank you very much. No, obviously I think we are, and I think you're all going to agree with this. I'll go through a few points about why I think this is important and what the implications are, yeah? So, we need to ask ourselves, I think, 3 questions. Why is this happening? How long is it going to happen for? And most importantly, what are the implications for us? Now, I'm very, very aware, listening to the speakers this morning, there's a lot of big brains in this room. I'm not a big brain, I'm a simple farmer. So I'm going to try and keep things quite simple and hope that you understand, that you appreciate what I'm trying to do. So, why? Why are we seeing this appetite? I think it's very obvious, it's food security. It's been mentioned many times before. I think we just need to put a few figures into perspective, yeah? Africa is already a net importer of food. Now, if you measure food security, The Economist has a food security index, and that puts, I think, Ireland first and Britain third. That's actually looking at 2 things. That's looking at your ability to produce food and your ability to buy food. Now, I think Rod talked about this, the Food Sovereignty Index is basically the ability to produce food. Yeah? And there's only 2 countries in Africa that are anything like food secure. It's actually quite difficult to measure this. Anyone want to guess what those 2 countries are? South Africa's one. The other one? No, it's Uganda. There are only 2 countries in Africa that are anything near food secure. So all the other countries in Africa are already net importers of food. Now, what we've seen with the Ukraine-Russia conflict is just how fragile the supply chain is, just how fragile, and COVID did the same thing. These are things that are very easy to disrupt. Egypt's been mentioned before. I think they import something like 80 to 90% of their grain from either Russia or Ukraine. Lots of African countries are in this situation. So the food distribution chains are very, very fragile. We need to add a few other factors to this. Population growth. The population of Africa is set to double. We can't do anything about this. In fact, it's going to be a little bit more in the north of Africa, a little bit less in sub-Saharan Africa, but basically the population is going to double. Climate change is going to take land out of production. I think this is accepted. It depends on which study you read and quite how bad climate change ends up being, but something between 15 and 35% of land currently farmed is going to be taken out of production by climate change by 2050. The other thing that's not mentioned so much is dietary changes. Now this is, as we get richer, there's a natural and understandable desire to want to have what I think we call a Western diet, basically more red meat. And this has quite a big implication because we know that red meat is a sort of land resource consuming practice. So all these things are pushing the situation and pushing food security. It's going to become a very, very big issue if it's not already. So, how long is this going to continue for? I don't see any downward pressure on this. I don't see any pressure that's going to stop this upward spiral in food security, upward spiral in investment opportunities, etc. I don't see any downward spiral at all for this. So what are the implications of this? I think we can say they're quite simple. We're going to see long-term food security issues. I've just realised it's down there. I don't have to crane my neck anymore, okay? So long-term food security issues, long-term food availability issues, long-term high food prices. And I think we're going to have long-term issues with inputs, most notably fertilizers and water. So I'm painting, I think, quite a worrying picture here, and I think we are right to be worried. So, what can we do? Well, previous speakers, particularly Dr. May, have already said quite a lot of what we can do. We're fortunate that the scope to increase production does exist. The average yield in Africa is much lower than what is possible. For example, the average yield of dairy cows is something like 1,200 litres per cow per year, whereas in UK it's at 9,800 litres per cow per year. Average yield of wheat in Africa is something like 1.3 tonnes per hectare. In UK, it's something like 8.4 tonnes per hectare. And these are not new technologies. This is perfectly achievable with current technology. Also, I think it's been mentioned by previous speakers, large amounts of land are not being farmed at the moment that could be brought into agricultural production. We need to look very closely at water use. Water use is going to be a huge issue. We're going to see a lot of fighting between urban and rural economies. I think those of you who live in Cape Town know that Cape Town, I think, nearly ran out of water a few years ago. First big metro in the world nearly ran out of water. And I know that it was presented that it was saved by the Cape Townians not flushing their toilets and not taking showers and things. Now, they were important. They did cut down the amount of water that was needed. But the main reason that the water in Cape Town was saved was that water was cut off to agriculture at quite an early stage. I think that this is going to see more of this fighting between urban and rural areas for resources. Post-harvest. Now, this is really important. In Africa, something like 30 to 35% of crops are lost after harvest. So from the moment we harvest it to the time we use it, between 30 and 35% are lost. It's difficult to get accurate figures, but it's something like that. In Israel, it's 0.3%. So it shows you what is possible. And this is mainly harvesting and particularly storage. Lack of grain stores is the biggest issue here. So excuse me a second. I'm doing too much talking. But all of this is only going to happen if we maximize the investment climate, which is why we're all here. Yeah, trying to get as much investment into African agriculture as possible. But there is a positive implication of this. And this is sort of my message. There are sustainable and significant returns from investing in African agriculture. sustainable and significant. You heard recently from Rod from United Green, and he talked about how his company had done a very detailed analysis and had concluded that African agriculture is a very good investment opportunity, as well as all the social and environmental benefits that are also important. Other people are coming to that conclusion, and you're seeing more and more institutions, pension funds, etc., starting to invest. So we're all pushing the same way. All the big brains in this room are all pushing the same way, yes? And this is my sort of message, and I think it's fairly obvious, that sustainable and significant returns from investing in African agriculture due to, unfortunately, the food security issue. Right, just to quickly talk about some technology. It happens that some of these technologies are areas that UK is quite good at. That's just a pure coincidence. But these are some of the better technologies that are available that will help improve it. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. But water use technology, much better irrigation systems, much better water decision tools. We're seeing big growth now in vertical agriculture, growing farm in a box, which uses like 1% of the water. There's definite potential for that technology. Better agricultural machinery. I mentioned post-harvest technology, particularly grain stores. Livestock genetics, there's a lot that will help with increasing yield as possible, particularly by bringing this in down in the male line through frozen semen or embryos. Cold chain and cold chains is very important, and seed production. So a few areas that this is not new technologies. Technology is available. We just need to implement it in line with in consultation with investment strategies. Okay, so investment, I've said that. So, that figure, 45 billion. This is the amount of money the FAO think needs to be invested in African agriculture. They did a study last year where they concluded that 83 billion needs to be invested in developing world agriculture, of which 45 needs to be invested in Africa. I love it when people come up with figures like this. 45 billion, it's enormous, isn't it? When I was looking at this figure, I thought, I've heard that figure before recently. It's one of these weird coincidences. 45 billion is also the amount of money that President Biden had just put aside for climate mitigation in America. 44 billion is what Elon Musk has just paid for Twitter. Just let's let that sink in, yes? The amount of money required to invest in African agriculture is the same as Elon Musk has just paid for Twitter. Now tell me the money's not available. So, I'm just going to do a bit of an advert, if you will allow me, at the end of my talk. I work for the UK Department of International Trade. We have an agricultural sector promoting UK goods, services, and investment. We have 25 countries where we have a physical presence. Some of the people in this room urge you to come onto our stand and meet us. We've got people from Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. Our vision is to help African agriculture whilst promoting UK goods and investment. We help with market entry if you're a UK company or you're selling to the UK. Technical barriers to trade, we do a lot of work. We are, for example, also sponsoring the Secretariat of the Free Trade Agreement. We work closely with our colleagues in FCDO, in the development part of things. UK has its own investment, which we're keen to talk about. My colleagues from British Investment International, which is the UK's development bank, are here. This used to be the Commonwealth Development Corporation. UK Export Finance is available if you have a project and there's 20% UK content, then you are eligible for UK Export Finance, sovereign debt, quite good interest rates. We do a lot of deal matchmaking, trying to match investment with some of the people in this room. And there's also a number of development programs. Particularly, I highlight one called the Growth Gateway, which is a £55 million fund to help exporters from Africa into Europe. That's available for your project. You can apply today. Come and talk to me afterwards. We have a portal of UK companies. The website is there. If you want to look for particularly some of the technology I mentioned, you should find the UK companies providing that on that on that website there. If you want to contact me, you are extremely welcome. That's my email address. Please do add the number 2, because there's another David Burton in India who gets my mails and are getting quite cross about it. So, thank you. Hope that was what you were looking for. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. You have raised my level of optimism that we can crack this, because the opportunities for improvement, that was quite a long list, but also the 45 billion. ROT already has 5 billion, so that's over 10%. If we add up all the numbers that this afternoon in the DFI panel are going to be mentioned, I think we get to 45 billion. So somebody should add it up. Thanks, David. The next speaker is, before we go to the panel, is Alexander Kaufman. Alex, shall I say Alex? Yeah. Alex serves as an agribusiness investment specialist at FAO Investment Center. We also will see him coming back this afternoon for the DFI panel, but for now, Alex, over to you.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here this morning and tell you about the do's and don'ts to achieve a perfect blend. I'm not going to talk about whiskey or cocktails. You heard the minister say that the beer would come later anyway. This is about blended finance and the specific case of investment funds financing the agri-food sector. There you go. So, what the problem we looking at? Well, in this room, we've heard this morning, we all know that the agri-food sector needs more investments, which obviously require more financing. Well, I'm afraid these figures are a bit higher than what my colleague just showed before. Maybe that's because of inflation, quite high these days. But, and I don't know, honestly, how accurate they are. But still, they give us a good order of magnitude of what is needed. So 75 billion, that's approximately the financing gap across agri SMEs in sub-Saharan Africa. And 300 billion, this is what global food systems need if we want to radically transform them in a more sustainable way, right? Well, what we know as well is that there is no way this money is going to come from the public sector alone. There is no fiscal space. And also, we must say that the track record of public agricultural finance has been rather mixed. DFIs are a different animal, but still owned mostly by countries. They're doing a lot, and we calculated that in a year like 2019, so pre-COVID, the 10 largest DFIs financing private sector invested about $3 billion in the agri-food sector. So quite a lot, but clearly not enough. Which means that we need more private capital, not rocket science, right? But the issue is that the sector is also perceived as being more risky and more expensive. This fascinating chart is based on analysis of 175 investment funds targeting emerging market with a development impact, so it's both debt funds and equity fund. And as you can see, funds focusing on the food and agriculture sector posted higher management fees, had a higher expense ratio, and also higher write-off. And obviously, well, when your TR is twice higher than peers, you're likely to post a lower profitability. As well. So I don't want to sound too negative. There are a lot of great investment opportunities in the sector. You can make a lot of money by financing the agri-food sectors. I know that many investors in this room have built a very successful and resilient portfolio in the sector, but it's fair to say that we're talking about a complex and specific sector, like colleagues said. So what can we do? And could blended finance, the mixing of concessional capital with private capital be an answer to that problem? At FAO Investment Center, we don't invest ourselves. We advise investors and help them to do more and better in the agri-food sector. And over the last 4 years, we've actually helped financial investors to set in place or invest into such blended structures. And the answer to the question is that it's actually a bit too early to answer the question. Just because many of these initiatives are fairly new, and the jury is still out there. But still, we can share some lessons learned, and I agree with the colleague who talked before, that's indeed something very, very important. One of these lessons is that it works. Like we've seen examples where the provision of concessional capital with some de-risking tools was really instrumental in the mobilization of more private capital to finance both sustainable and additional agri-food projects. And I think we are lucky to have the fund manager of Agri in this room, which is a blended initiative backed by the European Commission. And that's one of these success stories. So that's encouraging, but is it enough to scale up and reach the figures we saw before? Well, time will tell. But in the meantime, what we can see is that mixing different investors with different culture, different objectives can be a challenge, especially in terms of corporate governance, right? How do you set up an efficient corporate governance which keeps all these different stakeholders happy? That's quite a challenge. We've also seen that it's been more easy to satisfy investors' risk appetite or lack of risk appetite than investors' returns expectations. And that's maybe a place where more could be done. And lastly, the financing of SMEs is clearly a segment where you have a lot of investment opportunities, especially in Africa. But it also comes with the cost, because financing 10 loans at 1 million euro is going to be much more than 10 times more expensive than one single loan of 10 million euro. So this comes with a cost, and it needs to be addressed if you don't want to deter the private investors. Based on that, what advice can we provide to both concessional and commercial investors? Well, the first one is to clarify whether capital mobilization is a priority or not. And who are you targeting as a co-investors? TFIs, donors, foundations, pension funds, family offices, bank. That's crucial because everything, or almost, in your fund or a vehicle will need to be structured in function of the profile of the co-investors you target, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of legal framework, and also a big part of your investment strategy. 3, don't reinvent the wheel. Setting a new investment fund, blended vehicle, can take a lot of time and resources, a lot of investment opportunities out there. So look at what's available, and when you invest into a fund, don't try to, or don't expect to revolutionize this fund. You're likely to be disappointed. When you invest into a fund, you also invest in a fund manager. 4, be flexible. A certain level of specialization is good, but sometimes there is also a tendency to have a very narrow investment strategy which can make capital allocation slow and difficult. So that's also a very, very important point. Don't expect one single project to tick at once all the development objectives you have in mind, from gender to climate impact to supporting smallholders, etc. 5, keep it simple. The very logic of blended finance should be to facilitate financing, not to make it more complex. And here maybe a common mistake is to think that the provision of concessional capital is going to immediately attract commercial investors and vice versa. it's more complex. So really keep it simple in terms of corporate governance, in terms of monitoring requirements, in terms of reporting. 6, we saw before that tackling risk appetite was easier than return targets. And that's partly because of the high transaction cost affecting the financing of agriculture. So think about how can you tackle these bottlenecks, which are well identified. Think about maybe if you're a concessional investor, how can you cover part of, I don't know, the FX cost to hedge the foreign currency and risk and incentivize investors to provide more local currency when needed. Maybe cover some of the costs associated with the management of collateral, things like that. And the last point is what's also quite striking is the consensus among both concessional and commercial investors about the importance of technical assistance and knowledge, because knowledge is really perceived as a very strong de-risking tool as well. So that's it. Actually, this brief, this material is going to be summarized in a brief which FAO will publish soon. So if you have any question, any comment, please don't hesitate to come to me, write to me on that email. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. As I said earlier, we will see Alex back this afternoon when he will be moderating a panel. I thought this chart on management fee and expenses and loss rates was very, very interesting, and I hope somewhere this afternoon we come back to that and better understanding where that comes from and what can be done about that. Last part before lunch is a panel conversation. We're focusing in now more in the micro. How can we boost profitability at a farm level? So from very high, we go now a little bit back to the on the ground. I would like to introduce Philani Mzila. He is who's going to lead the panel. And Philani is an investment manager at Founders Factory Africa. He's there currently focused on building and scaling fintech, health tech, and agri-tech ventures in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a different generation than mine, clearly. He's also an academic, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot of stuff from this discussion. Welcome, Philani. Good to see you.
Good, good.
Maybe we can try to keep...
Hello. Can you guys hear me? Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this session. I have a very exciting panel today of deep sector experts from across the continent, so I'm just going to ask them to come up, and then we'll do short intros at the beginning. So I've got Geketso Chaladze from Lesotho Millennium Development Agency, Seelan Gubulsami from Omnia Holdings. If you could please come up. Mamati Tembe from Bayer in the Africa division. We've got Ousu Akoto from FreezeLink in Ghana. We've got Sane Steamers from Afex Commodities Exchange. And then lastly, we've got Tobias from BayWa. I think that's the right pronunciation, from out in Germany. I think you can give them a round of applause, please. Great, amazing. So, as you can see, we've got quite a diverse panel to my right-hand side, so I'll allow us to do just some brief introductions. And just to the panel, I think let's try be as informative as possible, because I think the audience is looking for a lot of more practical solutions rather than academic solutions, so looking forward to the discussion. So I think Tobias at the end, please go ahead. You just need to press that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, now it should work. Short introduction of myself. I'm Tobias Fausch. I'm the CIO of BayWa AG. We're a German company which is 100 years old and in ag since the beginning.
Go ahead.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Seelan Gobel-Samy. I'm the CEO of Omnia Holdings. We are a business based in South Africa. We operate across a number of continents across the world. In essence, our business is 70 years old, and we focused on using ammonium nitrate, not only for agriculture, but also for explosives. And our purpose is to make a difference, a positive difference in all of the countries and territories that we operate in. Thank you.
Good morning, all. My name is Mamadi Tembe. I'm the head of Public Affairs, Science and Sustainability for Bayer here in Africa. Bayer is a company that's focusing on life sciences, health, and agriculture globally, and then we have a significant presence here in Africa, and we'll talk about the different countries later. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Keketso Chalatse. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Lesotho Millennium Development Agency. We are in partnership with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is our donor from the US government. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Owusu Akoto. I am the founder and CEO of FreezeLink. FreezeLink is a cold chain logistics one-stop shop based in Ghana with the scope of West Africa. And we are working on building West Africa's first third-party cold chain logistics network. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sana Stamers. I'm here from Nigeria on behalf of AFEX. AFEX is a commodities exchange that's just 8 years old, but has grown in 8 years' time to provide supply and demand matching for over 800,000 tons of commodities. We provide services and market access for over 400,000 farmers. And we have recently launched an investment arm as well that raises working capital for processors and traders.
Amazing. Thank you all for joining me. I think let's get right into the discussion. Keketso, I'd love to get your take on what you think, or rather the role that policy plays in ensuring like grassroots profitability from a farming perspective. What do you think are the enabling factors from a policy perspective?
Thank you very much. Policy plays a big role in the agribusiness because it sets the stage for the role that the landholders can play. It also sets the stage for the role that investors can play. Overall, it plays a very important role in anchoring the economy of the country. Thank you.
No, amazing. Sane, I'd love to get your take here. So we obviously have quite a few, I guess, policy efforts, but from a, I guess, practical perspective, do you think that smallholder farmers should continue as is to achieve profitability, or is there an opportunity to consolidate themselves to access larger markets?
Thanks for the question. I think the answer to this question, and to be honest, a lot of questions in this sector, is really in segmentation. What we see globally is that smallholder farming, if done well, may provide enough income for one person, but not necessarily an entire farming household. Especially if you add to the mix that farming households tend to be large families. It's hard to feed an entire family just based on a 1 or 2 hectare farm. We have data from different African countries, from different crops, and we basically see that at least 5 hectares is needed to get farmers above the poverty line. And those 5 hectares would ideally have 2 or 3 different crops and a bit of livestock on the side. From 20 hectares and up, we can farm more commercially. We can introduce mechanization, we can introduce more efficiency. And those are pilots that I do feel are needed. In Southern Africa, farm sizes start from about 10 hectares. But if you look at West and East Africa, where we're active, there's a long way to go, and that's definitely one of the things that we feel we need to make progress on.
No, great. Thank you for that. I'd love to get your take here, Seelan, on some of the work around inputs that you can do in terms of, or rather to maximize farm profitability? Sure.
Well, maybe let's start with the farm itself. I think what we know that a lot of land on the African continent is semi-arable. So the first thing farmers need to focus on is to ensure that they are incredibly efficient, and efficient not only from a cost perspective, but also efficient from a sustainability perspective. What we've done is we've put a number of processes in place that actually help farmers, one, analyze the soil, ensure that they use the required amount of water and nutrients, and not more, you know. So we have probes in a number of our customers. Those probes can determine the soil moisture content. They can also, we analyze the soil. We do that in a number of countries across the continent. And, you know, just to give you a small anecdote, we're able to predict the accuracy or the crunchiness of an apple from the sap of a 6-week apple plant. And that just assists our farmers to be precise, to be accurate, to use water carefully, to use nutrients carefully, and also, you know, to look after the environment, because the more efficient we are, it enhances the farm's profitability, it reduces the cost, but it also is more sustainable for the environment. And we know ultimately that all of that needs to come together to do good for our farmers.
Sticking with the theme of inputs, I'd love to get your take, Mamati, on sort of the role that biotechnology has to play in terms of improving the seeds that we have, the seedlings that we're planting, and sort of how that links to increasing yields.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you touched on the seed, because that seems to be one part that is usually neglected and is a foundation of all that goes into the field. When we talk about the African perspective, before we even talk about biotechnology, there's a lot that we actually do as an organization to ensure that the quality of the seed that goes into the ground, it's of high quality in order to improve profitability, actually. And then also how the whole plant is taken care of, that is very important. And coming back to biotechnology, it's one of the technologies that has actually helped many farmers in the world. South Africa is a beneficiary of the impact of what that technology has done. So there is a lot of data and a lot of really good incomes from a wide spectrum of farmers. It's one technology that even smallholder farmers were able to get the massive benefit. So that's where we are really excited and looking forward to the opportunity of having other African farmers having access to biotechnology seed in their country so that they can improve profitability. But maybe just to add one little point is that because the technology is already on the seed, even in cases when farmers are not very strong in the agronomic practices, which we focus on strongly, they already benefit. It's not the only solution, but it's a very, very, very useful technology that really creates a leap just at one farmer level. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And I mean, you touched on technology a few times. I'd just like to ask a follow-up there is like, what are you seeing from an adoption perspective from farmers in terms of technology and enhancing their yields through the use of, I guess, digitization?
I will quote one farmer once. He said, as farmers, you fool me once, but if I keep on using it, then it works. And what we're finding is that for one of the things that we're focusing on as a company is also on the data science. We use a lot of digital in order to help the farmers to really be precise. When you look at the large-scale commercial farmers with the field view, they're actually able to see their fields, and then they're able to know that we don't have to probably spray the whole field, but we're much more specific. But when it comes to the smallholder, one of the big difficulties is access to that innovation. As a company, we say we have innovation, but it's not available there. So for them to have access to it, we also have to look at the way of distribution. What is the last mile? That's what we call it. Because many of them already spend the money They just spend money wrongly or they spend money on the wrong things. So how do we enable the farmers to use that money very constructively? If you're planting the seed, how well do you plant it? It's something as simple as many farmers will plant 3 in a hole. I know it's very basic what I'm talking about, but it's the reality of many. A lot of money that's being invested, how does it get spent? But when you sit down with a farmer to say, yes, this is the technology, but this is how you use it. And also working with communities, we have like some entrepreneurs, which becomes very easier with the digital because we work with them in a digital platform. We incentivize them to actually go to the ground. They also work with the farmers. They teach them how to benefit from their technology. So from the seed, from crop protection, from biotech, from digital, but not just alone as an organization. We found that we're working in the whole value chain with the different stakeholders, some from the input, some from the output. So the idea is that the solution is not going to come at once, but where we can hit hard, let's maximize on that because seeing is believing, and then the more they do, the neighbor sees and he learns from it. So it's a little bit of an ecosystem approach rather than just a one product focus.
I love that. Seeing is believing. I think a lot of farmers sort of share that sentiment. Tobias, I'd love to get your view on one of the other constraints that we haven't really been paying attention to, water scarcity, right? So what are some of the things that farmers or solutions that farmers can implement in order to use less water resources to get the same sort of outputs?
Well, thanks for that question. Water is really scarce. It's a problem in many places in the world. And one of the things is that a lot of water is used in agriculture. But pretty often, that's what we see is the farmer does not really know how much water to really use. So what we have developed over the last 30 years is a plant growth model that actually calculates how the roots grow, how the leaves grow, and we can make yield predictions in tons per hectare with that. But because we have such a model, we can simulate what happens if you irrigate how much, if you use nitrogen, how much, and when, depending on the plant growth, depending on the weather. So what we have done, for example, in Zambia, we have a farm that we support since 2017, and we could show that while reducing the water consumption by 30%, we still increased the yield by 25%. So it has a massive positive impact in both directions. Less water, less input, less cost, but still optimizing the yield.
No, great. And so we've spoken a bit about inputs now, and I'd love to get your take, Owusu, on we've now grown this product, we've got the commodity. How do you look at sort of aggregation and distribution playing a role? And I'd love to get your sort of anecdotal evidence from the Ghanaian environment and the West African environment.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a great question because you may have great seeds, great soil, but then what happens to the rest? In some value chains, we have 60% post-harvest losses. I was on a call last week with a contact in Ivory Coast. They have 60% post-harvest losses in mango in that country. So, imagine if 60% of phones that we pay for some reason, didn't get to our palms. So the bit about the storage and the transportation is so key. So I think that there are a few ways that we look at it. One is around the innovations, the technology innovations. So we're working on a project, which is the World Bank funded project, in the Cotonou International Airport. So what we are doing is building a refrigerated terminal for fruit and vegetables, which will enable farmers in Benin who are growing chili pepper, mango, pawpaw, pineapple, to pre-cool their produce, which extends the shelf life, and then enable them to tap into the high-value markets for fruit and vegetables. So infrastructure, as some of the speakers spoke about, you can't get away from infrastructure. Cold chain is an interesting space. I think that in 10 years' time, we'll look at this particular point in time and think this was a special time for cold chain in Africa, because you now have modular cold storage solutions, which are quicker to install, they are easier to maintain, and they're tried and tested in Africa, but they're not equally distributed. So, you find them far more in Southern Africa than East Africa, and in West Africa, almost nothing there. So there is a huge upside for us. Secondly, the innovation comes in terms of energy. So we happen to work in the food sector and the pharmaceutical sector. We distribute everything from vaccines to ice cream. But we see that the biggest opportunity really is in the fruit and vegetable sector in West Africa, because that is where you see the biggest poverty of cold chain, the chill chain. And so, if you imagine the farms around sub-Saharan Africa, how many of them are connected to the national grid? So solar, in as much as batteries and panels on the long term continue to go down in pricing, a very crucial part. And then the third and final answer, I would say, is around business model innovation. There are companies who are also doing cold chain that are focused purely on the EPC side or purely on selling assets. But how do you tap into even those farmers who have high potential to do export markets where they don't happen to have $1 million or $2 million for, let's say, 1,000 square meter pack house with cold storage inside? So we are looking at that issue in terms of owning and operating assets and delivering cold chain as a service from the farm to the palm of the customer, whether they are local or whether they are international.
Sane, I see you nodding vigorously. I'd love to get your take on what are the trends you're seeing from the Nigerian market with regards to aggregation and distribution.
Yeah, I think it's something that I recognize. Storage, I think, is key for a number of things. Food waste is a real issue in many countries due to bad infrastructure, but also price volatility, glut harvest. Because a lot of farmers produce in their traditional methods, they're dependent on when it rains, and they harvest at the time that everybody else harvests. Introducing things like irrigation, introducing things like spreading out harvest, in fruit and veg greenhouses could spread out harvest, for example, is definitely something that is needed. Storage is also one of the things that we see as a definite need in Nigeria and in the other countries across Africa that we're working in. What we've seen is that if a farmer is not forced to sell at the time of harvest, but you offer him storage at a fee for maybe a month or two, not just for perishables alone, but also for a product like maize, where we just need to make sure it's not eaten by rodents and humidity is controlled, the price can increase between 30% and 40% on average, just by holding it to a time that the market is ready to pay the price and there's no glut. So I fully agree that storage is one of the important things that we need to work on to increase farmer profitability.
No, that's fascinating. Geketso, I'd love to get your take here, right? So we've spoken a bit about sort of inputs, the processing, and now we're sort of moving into the territory of outputs, right? So what do you think, or rather what interventions can be put in place to ensure that like farmers can access a wider set of markets? I mean, coming from Lesotho, a relatively small market, how do you think you can help your farmers access more profitable markets?
Thank you very much. The export market in Lesotho, indeed, is quite limited. We have a lot of smallholder farmers and small investors in general. We think that there are, like last week we were in Swaziland, we were on excursion there looking at different types of ways and means to help or facilitate export market to make it really work. We think the private entities could be established, but it's very important that government, as public sector, stands to support the export market. The export market requires accreditation, it requires certification, all those standards and requirements are very fundamental for export. So private entities may not, as smallholder farmers or as small investors, may not be in a position to meet global gap standards, for example. They need support, a linkage. One of the models that we observed, which we are contemplating looking into, is to have one central entity that would aggregate, that would take responsibility for standards and meet those requirements that are required for export, and then establish quality controls and measures internally and own up aggregated farm conglomerates, and then help them qualify. Any one of those who feel at any point in time is capable of taking it on for themselves, now looking at different, more beneficial opportunities, can do that. But that hand-holding is very, very fundamental for young investors, young farmers, to get up to their feet and then run it themselves.
No, amazing. I'd love to get before I take sort of questions from the audience, I'd love to get your take, Tobias, on how collecting data and sort of processing that can aid in assessing investment opportunities from a farming perspective. What is some of the work that you guys are doing to aid farmers on that perspective?
Well, as I said, the one thing is we have a model to calculate water consumption, water needs. We can do that for a region, so we can see if there's enough water available for a certain crop. And if you know that there's crop, then you know it makes sense to invest in irrigation. But if you would not have enough water, maybe you should go for another crop. And then you just have to take that decision. Now, if you combine these models with the climate model, or various climate models, you can see how will that develop in future. What's happening in 2050? Will we still have, if we still grow corn, if we still grow wheat, if we grow cassava or whatnot, will the climate still be favorable to have good crops? And if not, would irrigation help? And if irrigation helps, do we have the water? Or what precautions do we have to take to have enough water? All this can be simulated today, and you can do that for a region, for a full river flow, you can do it for a country, and that helps really take on decisions on how to develop, how to push farming, and how to become successful and have food security.
No, great. Seelan, I'd love your take as well. I think I see you're partly in agreement.
I am, thank you. I think, you know, the problem to solve is to actually get investors, you know, service providers like a number of us on the stage and farmers together. Because ultimately what you do is you reduce the risk of the investment. You reduce the risk of the financiers who are backing this agriculture value chain, which is long, you know, which goes beyond a typical business cycle, and I think which is so important for food security and what the world's population need. You know, and we heard a speaker this morning talk about Africa, you know, really being a net importer of food, which is something we need to change over the next few decades to ensure that there's more and more sustainable farming on our continent.
No, great, thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience. If I could have like 3-4 questions for our panel. Any questions? Can we please get him a mic? Wendy.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Johan West. I'm from the founder of Green Africa Group. We are agricultural and environmental and climate change adaptation consultants. And we do work all over Africa, right up to Morocco. One of the things that I noticed, as you all know, Africa's got the potential, but there's so many failed projects in Africa and evidence of failed projects. I've got a whole portfolio of equipment of billions of rands standing in countries like South Sudan and all over with grass growing through them. And I found that one of the major problems is that the funding is there. The capital is there, the will is there, but the knowledge is not always there. And there is service providers, which like yourselves, that provides fantastic technical services, but for some reason the investors or the clients are very reluctant to make use of consultants for feasibility studies, for management plans, education, training, to actually make these projects work. And now they do make use of consultants, but I just feel that is one of the major problems. There's a lot of projects that wasn't feasible from day one, and especially with climate change, as one of the speakers said, major big areas in Africa is not going to be really suitable for agriculture, or the crops is going to change. So my question is just that, I don't know if you can answer it, but it's more a statement actually, but for some reason there is this reluctance just to spend a little bit money, 0.01% of the project on proper feasibility studies, and to make sure that these projects work.
Thank you for that. I'd like to get your take, Gegetso, on sort of mechanisms like feasibility studies in terms of de-risking investments into these projects. Do you have a view on what role they play?
Yes, indeed. Feasibility studies are key to studying any venture, in fact. It's an activity in which surely some of the people who are cost conscious are reluctant to venture in. But it is a cost that one should be, any investor should be willing to pay to know whether that venture is profitable or not profitable. Venturing into farming without doing a feasibility study is actually a dangerous game, because capital costs, running costs, all those investments without the feasibility, without that litmus test that is saying this is good, this is maybe, this is you should not, then it's that cost that when we are farmers, it has to be part of the exercise that you say, I pay for information knowing whether I should do this or I shouldn't. Of course, there are different levels. You do the preliminary feasibility, and then from the preliminary feasibility study, you should get a feel of whether you should continue to do a detailed feasibility or not. Then a fairly rounded feasibility that would give you different aspects, the technical aspects, the economic aspects, is a good way to go to be able to say, I do this or I don't, or maybe in the near future. It's a good exercise to do.
No, thank you. And Sane, I'd love to get your take, but more from a grassroots level perspective.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add there is I relate to the concern. There are solutions that exist and money is needed to scale them. I am quite optimistic, however. So firstly, also in response to feasibility studies and how do you raise those funds and what can trigger that. I'm personally a big believer in proofs of concept. Feasibility studies tend to be documents, and having been a consultant for 20 years of my career, I know that you can get a document to say whatever you like by selectively picking your evidence, right? So proofs of concept is what we should be looking at. And I think for all of us that are in the business, that are trying to raise funds to scale, we should make sure that we just start small, have a pilot, have some evidence, document the evidence, both the numbers as well as the narratives of the stakeholders involved. On the optimistic side, I also see a lot of traction on that front. I do see that there's a lot of interest from investors, both on the continent and globally, who are looking at agriculture now. And I think this has changed significantly in the past 10 or so years. There is a lot happening. With AFEX, we're currently also in the middle of a debt and equity raise. And we are seeing a lot of traction in that area. So I do agree. I do agree that more money is needed. We also see that agribusiness is a very small percentage of investors' portfolio currently, especially compared to the GDP value that it has. But I see a trend that's going in the right direction. So I'm quite positive. And I think it's up to all of us here to make sure that we have the proofs of concept and actually sell the message better.
Great, thank you. Okay, I've been told time. I think let's have a few closing remarks from the panel. We can start at the end there with Tobias, just on your thoughts on the panel and thoughts going forward.
Well, I think what we saw it in the morning, we saw it in this discussion, that there is a lot going on. There's a lot of options, of opportunities, but it's very hard to bring it into the field to really have the success. And it's a very complex problem also. You start with infrastructure. You have to deal with political boundary conditions. You have to deal with farmers who are used to do it that way, and they need to be trained, and they need to understand that you have more modern ways of doing it, which are more successful. So all in all, it's a very complex topic, but there's a lot of initiatives going on, so that's very positive.
Great. Sinan?
I think just in closing, I think it's important for all of us to do our little bit to make sure that Africa gets access to the best, world-class and latest resources and technology. So I think as Omnia, we ensure that whether you are a large commercial farmer in South Africa or whether you are a subsistence farmer in Zambia, you are getting the best of breed of technology, of science, of data, and that is shared across all of our continents, our countries, and the markets we operate. I think it's really, really important that we find solutions for this challenge of getting us to work together, getting us to do what is right, not only for the farmer, but for the country, for the communities, and for the environments that all of our stakeholders operate in.
Thank you. Mamati?
Thank you. One thing to always remember is that whatever decisions that we make, even in the investments on the projects, is just to imagine the impact at one particular farmer at a time, regardless of scale. And also the conditions that those investments come with. Because at times we have a project, if it doesn't work, it's mostly sometimes with the detail, the assumption that we made in the implementation. That is where sometimes we are left out, because we come as a supplier and you think this is what I'm going to focus on, but it's actually the whole system. Just one remark, there was 5 million for a community. Everything was on point, the training was fine, all the stakeholders came in, but the one stakeholder was left was an agro-dealer distributor. They were expected to be the one to stock, and they did not have the funding, and then the funding did not make provision for them. So that is probably one ask to say, very practical, what happens at one farmer level, how does that farmer actually get the product? So if I'm a company, I just don't focus on my product, but how do I make sure that the innovation and the technologies are available at the last mile? So maybe that is the one message that we take with, one farmer at a time. What does it mean to that one farmer? Because whatever investment comes is only successful if one farmer at a time is successful, and that's where the profitability of the farmer comes in. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Gegetso?
Yeah, I was listening to the keynote speakers this morning. I was really intrigued by the public-private partnership kind of approach. And having looked at the past experience of agribusiness in Africa, I came to realize that we can't, investors on their own can't push this. Public on their own cannot push this. So in Lesotho, government of Lesotho has signed a 5 billion rand compact in May this year. 2 billion of it goes directly to market-driven irrigated horticulture. So we hear the bulk of that is is a form of partnership that our donor, Millennium Challenge Corporation and government of Lesotho are saying to the investors, to the NGOs, to the companies, hey, come, let's partner together. We are going to handle the services that are associated with linking up with the investors. We are going to offload the burden of infrastructure, dams, irrigation, all institutional reforms that are associated with land, with business, all those de-risking components and deloading components are in there. We are actually here to say, hey, come, let's go and build this 2,000-hectare horticulture project in Lesotho. And we are installed 6. We can meet in the closed sessions to talk more about this. But really, we as MCC and government of Lesotho are saying, surely, as I have noted, that everybody is concerned about the rate of progress that agribusiness is moving in Africa, in technology, in cracking the markets, in cracking the financing. It's really low. Can we do something? We are prepared to embark on that game. So I would like, in ending, to say we are here to look at partners to go right in there. And the government of Lesotho and MCC are saying, Lesotho is high, no disease, less diseases, less pests. We hit the market early. We are looking for anybody who can partner with us to move on there. But otherwise, agribusiness is the way to go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Also?
Yeah, thank you. I'll give a quick story about a farm visit I made on Friday last week. We visited a farm which is about 1.5 hours away from Accra, the capital of Ghana. It was a mango farm. And they had approached us for cold storage for 3 reasons. One is obviously to reduce the post-harvest losses. And it's useful to just touch upon how big an issue post-harvest losses are. The rotten food will pollute the waterways. There will be foregone opportunities. And what we find in Ghana, at least, is that the post-harvest jobs tend to be for women, disproportionately represented by women. And then we also know that rotten food it contributes 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So reducing the losses will have a huge effect on that community in the context whereby it's not only one farmer who is using the on-farm cold storage and the pack house. The second thing is the fact that, and this is not spoken about so much, but African fruit and vegetables exported from Africa command a price which is 55% below the global average, which is such an astounding statistic for us. Yeah. And infrastructure is such a key reason because of this. And then finally, shelf life. So this has been touched upon before, that this mango farmer, if he sells his mangoes during the typical harvest season, he will sell 1 kilogram of mangoes for 2 Ghana cedis. Now, if he waits for only 2 weeks after the season, he sells his mangoes for 8 Ghana cedis per kilogram. So there is a need for us to focus on our lanes, but also just to realize that at the same time, we need a systems approach to really move the needle, as somebody said earlier today.
Great, thank you for that, Sane.
Yes, I think I'm going to echo most of what my colleagues in the panel have mentioned. We need to increase farmer profitability. There's a lot of things that need to happen in parallel in order to do so. It needs knowledge, inputs, infrastructure, markets, capital, insurance. And I do also strongly believe that partnerships are the way forward.
Great, thank you for that. And yeah, thank you to my panel. Please, can you give them a round of applause? Yeah, thank you for the great discussion.
Thank you, Phila, for doing a great job. Just, I thank you to the panel. The rest of the day's proceeding is that we will now break for lunch, and then we have an afternoon focused on a DFI forum. So I personally have never seen such a convening of DFI players. So this afternoon, almost every DFI organization you can think of is actually present here in Cape Town. And so there's a couple of sessions and two panels around DFI. So if everybody could be back here at 1:30, that would be fantastic. Thank you. That went well.